to obtain monetary remedies for these 52 individuals who were subject to discrimination. Now, analytically, there was a lot of pushback, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail about the whole decision-making process. But there are some who said, well, how is this a discrimination case, even though we have the language? But I think one of the workers put it best, quote, "We were chosen to suffer bad treatment and injustice because we were from India. We were told by the company that Indians were chosen because we came from the part of the world where many people are poor, and that we should be happy and not complain about whatever happened to us." Around the same time, we prosecuted another case in collaboration with this fantastic community-based organization, Thai CDC. And that was the Trans Bay case that involved the 48 Thai welders who were brought here under H-2B visas. They never worked as welders at all. They were not paid. They were held in the state of involuntary confinement. And their passports were also confiscated. Again, this is a trafficking situation. Unlike the Pickle case, we were able to resolve this case informally. So we worked out a consent decree, which is a settlement agreement, but it's also a judicial order. It's a public document. We can provide it to you. I'm sure it's easily accessible online. That provided for $1 million in damages for these victims. But as important as the compensation, as important is that Trans Bay also agreed to provide the workers future work. They provided them with housing. They paid a housing stipend. They paid a tuition and paid for tuition and books at a local college for training. Just incredibly creative, what we call in the legal field, injunctive relief. And that's very unique. I mean, that's a very unique tool that we have at the EEOC that I think many private litigants don't pursue and don't have. Now, about a month ago, the EEOC adopted its strategic enforcement plan, which sets forth its enforcement priorities for the years 2012 to 2016. One thing I want you to know about this enforcement plan, that a top priority of the agency, this isn't just the rogue general counsel, a top enforcement priority for the agency is discrimination against immigrant workers, migrant workers, and other vulnerable populations. And this, to me, in some ways was a dream come true, because I know at the agency that we have a long history in many offices of providing leadership in this area in terms of addressing harassment against agricultural workers, sexual abuse against agricultural workers, addressing discrimination against immigrant workers. But this really reflects the fact that if you live in this country, you work in this country, you have the right to work in a discrimination-free environment. And there should be no safe harbors from enforcement of the discrimination laws, because an employer calculates that someone's not going to come forward either due to linguistic barriers, cultural barriers, or fear. And often this fear in this context is related to the whole immigration status. So this is very important, because this is our effort to bring people out of the shadows and make sure that they exercise their rights, because the rights will be a nullity. The anti-discrimination laws will be meaningless if they don't apply to all populations. What are some of the benefits of the EEOC's approach? And I'm not saying that this is a be-all and end-all. This is not a silver bullet. But there are certain things that I think that we bring to this conversation based on the work that we've done. First, a couple of these cases, and I think the global case that we mentioned earlier is one that I think is very high profile. In global, if you recall, there's a decision made by the Department of Justice not to prosecute this case criminally. Okay, and so I visited our local offices. Our local office in LA yesterday, the entire office is really devoted to the prosecution of this case. And we're bringing this case in Hawaii. We're bringing this case in the state of Washington. This is scorched earth litigation. There's a lot of money being thrown at us, and this is a very, very high priority case for the agency because it involves over 500 Thai workers who were subject to exploitation and discrimination. Now, the reason I mention that is because at a very basic level, one thing we bring to the table is that there's really a difference in the standards of proof. If you bring in a criminal prosecution, you need to establish proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay. In a civil context, it's a preponderance of the evidence, 51%. So there's a difference, and so there's certain cases that a prosecutor, in his or her prosecutorial discretion, will say it will be very difficult to establish this beyond a reasonable doubt, which in our prosecutorial discretion, using a different standard of proof, preponderance of evidence, means that we are able to go in there and obtain justice and hopefully obtain compensation for the victims of discrimination. Compensation, this is one thing that had me a little bit embarrassed when I was in Vienna. There was a whole day devoted to compensation for victims of trafficking and the challenges of obtaining compensation for victims of trafficking. And I know that in our cases, under the anti-discrimination laws in the United States, that back pay is available, emotional distress damages, compensatory damages for emotional distress, and punitive damages for the most egregious cases. And folks, these are among the most egregious cases. So the damage structure is really the envy of other law enforcement agencies across the country, across the world. There's also the private attorney generals. We are a poor agency, okay? And don't believe the hype about bloated government. We are a poor agency. But private attorneys are able to bring these actions also. They're able to bring civil rights actions that address issues of trafficking and worker exploitation. We're able to obtain injunctive relief. I talked about some of the injunctive relief we obtained in the Trans Bay case. That means that what we're trying to do is to make sure that it does not happen again at that workplace. And besides monetary relief, in some instances that we did in Trans Bay, we were able to obtain other types of benefits, such as a housing stipend or educational stipend. That puts us in a very unique situation. We operate in the public sunshine. What that means is that I can't come in here and tell you that we win every case, because you can look it up on the internet and find out that we don't. Okay, but what that also means is that when we prevail in a case, and we do in the vast majority of cases obtain relief, we will use it as a cautionary tale for the employer community to let them know that the EEOC is in business of preventing discrimination throughout the country and all forms of discrimination. And just as importantly, or in fact more importantly in this area, the fact that we operate in the public sunshine enables us to talk about these cases in a variety of stakeholder settings to raise people's awareness about their rights and to show people that, that we are in a position, hopefully, to secure their trust to come forward and exercise rights. It's very, very important. The last thing I want to mention in terms of, I think, the benefits is one thing that's very important, and this is not the same internationally, is that we enforce the civil rights laws regardless of immigration status. So if you come into our office, we don't ask about the immigration status. That has the same relevance as the color of your eyes. Okay, the laws are very clear about this, and we follow the laws. And our people are very, very aggressive in any effort to delve into immigration status as a litigation tactic. Our people go rabid, they go crazy, and they win in front of conservative judges. The other thing that I'm very proud of, and this is something that hopefully we'll be able to multiply nationally, we'll be able to replicate nationally, is that our lawyers practice in some areas, in this area in particular, the law that, at least when I was in law school, that they don't teach in law school. Okay? And that means that what they're able to do is they're able to create a safe space. They devote a lot of attention to creating a safe space so people will come forward and exercise their rights. It takes an enormous amount of patience. We're aided by the legal system. We're aided by the fact that we're a U visa certifying agency. We can certify T visas. So we have legal mechanisms to provide a safe space, but a lot of what we do is really at the grassroots level in terms of trying to get out and talk to people, because when we tell them we're with the government and we're here to help you, they have no reason to believe that based on their experience in their own countries or based on their experience here. So we have to make sure we earn their trust. Thank you.
Okay, the last person on our panel today is Rubén Garcia, who's a professor of law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He, prior to joining the UNLV faculty in 2011, he was professor of law and director of the Labor and Employment Law Program at California Western School of Law in San Diego. He also has held academic appointments at the University of California, Davis School of Law, the University of Wisconsin Law School, and the University of California, San Diego. Before beginning his teaching career in 2000, Professor Garcia worked as an attorney for unions and employees in the Los Angeles area. His scholarship has appeared in a number of leading law reviews, including the Hastings Law Journal and the University of Chicago Legal Forum. His first book, congratulations, was published by New York University Press in 2012. Is entitled Marginal Workers, How Legal Fault Lines Divide Workers and Leave Them Without Protection. I was thinking about it, I'm like, this guy must be a lawyer. If you see all these notes that he has here, it's frightening. I don't know how you organize all that stuff.
It is frightening.
Yeah. So we asked him to speak today. I mean, given all the conversations we've had, this idea about rights and sort of the confluence between traffic, the notion and language of victimization of human traffic subjects as opposed to the notion about immigrant workers or undocumented workers. Given today's political climate on immigration reform and migrant workers, to think about and to talk to us about the current political climate for migrant rights advocacy, right? And whether the stakes have improved or weakened over time, and what the future prospects are for this movement. And then all of that, of course, in the context of human trafficking, which poses a whole different level and introduces a new narrative to the discussion about immigrant rights reform.
Well, thank you, and thanks to the organizers, and thanks to everyone for being here. I'm a labor and employment law scholar, so I tend to think of things in that lens. And so I'm really glad to hear so much emphasis at this conference about labor rights, and I've definitely been concerned with that since the beginning of my career, in the ways that the labor law, and labor and employment laws failed to protect the workers that it's supposed to, and so that was the genesis for this book, Marginal Workers, and I think I'm still contractually obligated to plug it, so I have order forms here in case anyone wants to. You can get a discount, both a discount and free shipping if you're interested. But I think I'm glad to be on this panel because of the way in which it's really dealing with vulnerable workers, but also, and again, glad to hear the ways in which they've mobilized law to gain justice on the job. But really in the book, again, I discussed the ways in which, and you've heard the alphabet soup of guest worker programs, how they really have been rife with abuse for both trafficking and just basic labor rights violations. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, and again, as Juan said, a little bit about the current climate for advocacy for these workers, and also the shifts that need to take place in terms of the legal and political wins. But let me just again start with this panel and why I think I'm here. I think the panel is, as it was described earlier, dealing in particular with agricultural workers and domestic workers, and as Aquilina said quite clearly, the reasons for that exclusion are some of the reasons why we have so much human trafficking today, and that is the idea, and as David also mentioning, of course, the idea that people who are brought here to work, that sort of open season, fair game for any kinds of violations. And so again, I think that's one of the important things that we've seen in the discussions so far in this panel and earlier today. So really it's a question of, and my interest here is really the holes in the law, not just in terms of human trafficking, but also the holes in the law that are a breeding ground, or the margins really in the law that are a breeding ground for these violations. So what I've tried to do, and I think, again, the other thing that's really heartening about this conference is that there's been so much discussion of human rights, because that's exactly the frame that I wanted to use in this book to describe a way in which to get out of sort of the silos or the structures of law. Different agencies, I'll respect to a fine agency here, but in terms of the different agencies that sometimes see their own jurisdiction, I think it was discussed also in terms of the DOL sort of unable to take jurisdiction over various claims because, of course, of the exclusion that was mentioned in federal law. That, of course, does not mean there might be coverage under state laws, but I think the exclusion, again, says something about the way that these workers were valued all the way back in the 1930s and continue to be less valued and devalued today. So I think, and it's interesting too that in this conference we talked about the concern about sex trafficking and the historical antecedents of that in terms of white slavery and again, this idea of protecting the morality, as we heard from the keynote, the morality of women. And nowadays, we seem to be more interested in protecting the intellectual property on a pirated DVD being trafficked than the actual labor that's the workers are engaged in. So I just want to endorse then again, I want to start by just sort of laying out a few comments and then getting to some of the specific questions that we were asked. But I just want to endorse again the idea of empowerment, the title, as we said, the idea of empowerment instead of prosecution. And I think here the role of, and I think it's appropriate again on this panel that you have so many representatives from NGOs, worker centers. I think the role of NGOs and worker centers and unions are particularly critical in these areas. And as I said, when you have so many abuses going on in temporary worker programs, and you've heard a few of them today, the Global Horizons abuses, the Filipino teachers recruitment abuses, teachers in New Orleans after Katrina, all of these, relied upon, or at least were aided, the exposure of these violations, and also as Chancee said, the aftermath, dealing with the aftermath and the empowerment of the workers after their liberation. By the way, I was here in LA when that Thai worker slavery case was exposed and was part of the, again, the legal sort of strategy to sort of deal with these issues. So it's again, we tend to think of that sometimes as the first case where that really brought this into the public consciousness, but of course we know it's been an issue for many years before that. But again, the role of NGOs and unions such as the Southern Poverty Law Center, exposing abuses of forestry workers in the H-1B program, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, exposing slavery in agriculture in Florida, the Hershey's J1 guest worker scandal that was part of, or exposed in part by the labor movement of the bakery workers there. A landscaping company in Tennessee, again, all of these, through legal, as I think was rightly pointed out earlier, all these workers brought here through legal means that ended up being exploited. And I think so that's why in the book I discussed that the real problem with guest worker programs in general, in terms of expanding a democracy deficit, in terms of workers that are unable to really advocate for the rights that they're entitled to on paper, but don't have, again, the means to enforce, either because of fear or coercion, or simply because they're temporary. I mean, it's very hard, as you all know, these cases take a long time, and the incentives for workers to come forward knowing that relief might not come for years is very difficult for workers who are only here temporarily. And of course, again, the overlap between the idea of employee status in the United States and how it's supposed to be on equal footing for all workers, but as we know, cases like in Plastics versus NLRB, a 2002 U.S. Supreme Court case that really put immigrant workers, and specifically undocumented workers, on a different plane than other employees for remedy, for purposes of back pay remedies under the National Labor Relations Act. Those kind of cases really show that we need a different paradigm for the protection of workers, and that's why, again, I've been so heartened to see the emphasis at this conference in terms of employees, not as employees, but as workers, and labor rights as human rights, as ways for addressing these problems. So I just, as Juan said, want to talk a little bit now about the difficulty or the possibilities for future prospects in this current political climate. And I think, you know, we all are aware the immigration debate is, again, becoming front and center here with the re-election of President Obama. It has been a very toxic debate for a number of years, and that has, I think, only made it more difficult in terms of advocates for immigrants and for the victims of human trafficking. The only problem, again, and again, it's heartening to see the possibility of immigration reform, which, as I think we all know, would tend to reduce the possibility and the occurrence of human trafficking. Of course, wouldn't eliminate it, perhaps, but again, it would help towards the problem. The main problem, though, with even this new debate and this new going forward is that guest worker programs continue to be expanded and continue to be, again, a part of at least the debate about whether or not we should have immigration reform. And of course, you know, they're not going to go away even after, if there is an immigration reform and a path to citizenship. So this is the kind of difficulty that I talked about in the book, and that again, I think makes it hard for both guest workers and trafficked workers to have a real seat at the table in terms of the debate and in terms of their own place in it. And again, here I think it's important, the role of unions and NGOs is incredibly important. In this current political debate, it's also been, as it often is, open season on immigrants. It's often open season on unions. And so unions are struggling in this for survival in this environment, even in a state like Michigan. And so, again, I think that makes it harder for them to be effective advocates. Of course, you know, again, there are different unions. It's a broad sort of swath of the labor movement, but there are some unions that have been very active in terms of domestic worker rights, such as the Service Employees International Union and other unions. The AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, obviously very concerned about these teacher recruitment programs that have tended to go sour, and so they have a role to play. But in this political environment, when they are seeing politicians coming at them, that limits their ability to, again, the resources to fight on behalf of trafficked workers and guest workers as well. So I think I want to just close with some of the shifts that I think we need to see take place. A bigger shift, I think, is what we're seeing at this conference today. And again, I think it's such an important thing for the messages and the presentations of this conference to get out far and wide in terms of, you know, influencing the debate as a matter of labor rights, human rights, and I think, of course, better data is necessary here in terms of making sure that we know sort of, again, what's going on in these temporary worker programs. Legally speaking, I've argued for again, not so much legal solutions, but a different way about talking about these issues that, again, I think is very familiar to the people in this room and at this conference. That is, again, if we stop to see, and again, I think the tremendous role, an important role for domestic law enforcement, both, you know, again, whether it's employment discrimination or wage and hour, a number of different places, and those are all extremely important. And certainly cooperation between those agencies is extremely important because, as we know, these workers tend to have different kinds of issues that don't fit neatly into statutory boxes. So again, in terms of how the debate is framed, to go to that, I, in the book, of course, advocate a human rights approach in terms of how we view these workers as workers. And again, I think the important role that the ILO and other sort of international organizations can play, again with proper advocacy, is something that I think is already familiar to the people in this room, in this conference. So again, I think in terms of the where we should go from here, we should again try to have more cooperation and try to deal with some of the silos that exist. And I think, again, as a labor person, it's great to be here at this conference, and certainly to work with people who are coming at it from different angles, but all with the same goal, that is for greater worker human rights.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we have about 33 minutes for discussion, question and answer. They asked me to talk for half an hour, and I'm not going to talk for half an hour. But I do have a couple of sort of overarching questions, thoughts that I'd like to sort of maybe help to frame some of the discussion as well as your questions. And that's, the first point that I'd like to make is, how do we use this category of vulnerable workers as a strategic category for organizing around the power relations of trafficking and migration, right? How do we keep from creating new categories of good immigrants, right, and those that are classified as victims, and bad immigrants, those are then classified as illegal, undocumented immigrants, right? That I think a lot of the discussion around rights and discourse sometimes falls prey to, right? This notion about who is worthy and not worthy, right? And how do we move from victims to empowered workers who have been victimized and exploited? And I think a lot of the discussion that we've heard today has certainly focused in, the whole genesis of this conference is to try to get us to reframe the way we talk about trafficking and to make it about vulnerable workers that are caught in various sort of relationships of exploitation based on various types of power hierarchies. And certainly we can talk about it, gender and sexuality and race, the kinds of ways that these categories are legally rendered, right, that can be defended in policy decisions or in a court of law. But I think also, sort of leading up to this point, is how do we make sure that the laws that are passed and adopted are actually reflective of things that are happening on the ground and lead us into a discussion about how do you actually build power, right? And getting back to that point, moving away from victimhood to a position of empowerment. And I think the work that the Thai CDC and Filipino Workers Center, and among a lot of other organizations that are doing this kind of work, that notion about building policy from the ground up, right? In a way where people are involved, the very people that are involved in these relationships are actually involved in passing new policies that are going to make sense, not only in terms of the legal ramifications, but also in terms of trying to build something among a group of workers that have been categorized as victims for a very long time. So I think that notion about building policy from the ground up, and the kinds of relationships that are formed between academics, government agencies like the EEOC, and these grassroots organizations are very, very important to actually reframing the work that's happening, and to build something that actually makes sense and works on the ground. So anyways, I think those are some overarching themes that emerge from the conversations that people have talked about today. So let's move to questions. All right, does anybody want to address that specific question on the panel first, or those series of thoughts?
Well, I would just like to say, what you talked about in terms of the immigration system, the Kabbalah, I was thinking, like, how can we have people understand the immigration system in America in the same way, like you said, this structured violence, against the immigrants. And I think that hasn't been brought to the larger, immigration dialogue or debate. And like you said, we always fall into like good immigrants and bad immigrants. The dreamers were brought here on their own because their parents violated, so their parents are the criminals. How do we see and how we frame, overall undocumented workers as criminals? But then it's really, and if we saw it in like as we're trying to do with domestic work, is along a spectrum that they're all victims of as well.
And I think that really speaks to this notion that, I think it is of note that until recently itself wasn't ranked in the report, right? So it's this idea that these are things that happen over there really is quite pervasive, and the reality is that the framing of what is happening over there is quite salient for what's happening here as well. It really was, I think, one of the greatest achievements of the current administration was making sure that the U.S. was also included in the CHIP report, because it made it have a lot more teeth. Certainly, as somebody who's worked most of my life outside of the United States, one of the big frustrations I would hear from people is, well, why isn't the U.S. ranked itself? And why doesn't the U.S. turn inward? And there's this critique of Kafala, and but what about the fact that it's modeled off of Bracero? What about all of sort of historical legacies?
And I think both of you raised 2 points. One, it was a big deal for Amnesty International to start talking about human rights abuses along the border, right? The border enforcement policy. For that very same reason, the fact that those things are tend to seem that they're happening elsewhere, not here. And then two, a lot of the dreamers took positions of, we're not going to say we're worthy and our parents are not. That they did something, we're victims and our parents are the persons that brought us here legally. So there was an adamant stance that they took against that, positioning of themselves as, deserving victims. At the same time, you recognize the kind of political capital that brings to the table in terms of a practical politics, right? And
So the legislators again and again.
Right. So it is a strategic positioning that you take, right? That can be very powerful as well. Okay, questions? Here, let's start.
Hi, I'm Annie Fukushima. I'm a visiting lecturer at Scripps College, so I'm going to say hi to stay there. I wanted to ask a question about this concept of culture, because I think that one of the things that it's not really coming up in the discussion is all the other things that are coming up, such as globalization, migration, all these things. And I feel that culture is really essential. For example, Rocco Ray talks about cultures of servitude and as traveling, right? And so when I think of that, I think of the Dan versus United States case, in which her trafficker was also Peruvian, and there's a culture of servitude in Peru where they're from that traveled with them into the United States. And we have our own cultures of servitude here that created those normalcies that was coming up in the discussions that you guys are raising. I think also one of the other things about culture is it also impacts our perception of success. And so when we're trying to move from prosecution to empowerment, we have to really think about, well, how do these different institutions have a different culture that impacts the way they view success, that then impacts the way they view those that they're working with, whether they're migrants, whoever it is, the various populations that you're working with. So, yeah, I was just hoping we could talk about culture.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't have enough time to add that element to my presentation. But yes, I named as one of the factors causing new form of slavery also historical culture and some religion in some countries. And I didn't mention that because we didn't have time to go into it. But some of the victims and survivors that we worked with, we actually had to help overcome their diminished status as social pariahs in their own community and within the Thai culture, because that's exactly what they were reduced to, and they were actually seen as workers who were upsetting the status quo of Thai social structure, which is feudal in nature, and that was totally unacceptable. They should have accepted their lot in life, having been born poor and within this rigid hierarchy of Thai society, where your status or ranking within that hierarchy is based on your gender and your economic status and your level of education. So these were people who this kind of informal caste-like system were ranked at the very bottom of that social structure, and so how dare they confront and challenge that structure. And so I think as an organization, and any organization is committed to social change, we have to refuse to accept these individuals' experience as slave laborers, to mark them for life as victims. We need to help them build an autonomous, independent life with an active role in their own legal and human rights struggle. And after we restored, of course, their free will and agency, because a lot of times they didn't even know what free will and free agency is, because they've never been really accorded that. And so there's a whole lot of consciousness raising that we have to do to help them stop thinking of themselves as quote-unquote servants in their master's house. And sometimes we as advocates even get relegated to that new role as the new patrons, the new master, and we like completely help them understand that no, this is a whole new way of thinking and resocialization that that we have to help them go through. And I think that we have seen by helping them become more politicized and organized, we have seen this kind of transformation from this kind of voiceless victim, timid, powerless, to a force for change. They now take an active role in changing some of the structural causation of their fight, and they join labor protests, they rally for workers' rights, they are part of political actions, and they cross all the ethnic and cultural lines as well. So, we have examples of that, but it's you've got to be committed to real social change in order to really see that succeed.
Can I just add? I also, one of the things I find troubling of this whole cultures of servitude is both the reproducibility and the sort of contagiousness of the cultures of servitude sort of phenomenon. I mean, one of the things I was troubled with in Dubai was just hearing the numbers of expats who would say, and of course I'm troubled by the language of expats as being people of a certain class and race, and they're migrants, but people who are saying the reason that they live in the Gulf is so that they can have a nanny and a gardener and a driver, and the way that they would talk about them changed a lot. And Julia O'Connell Davidson has written quite a lot about this. But even here, I mean, there's a somewhat fictional novel by Hector Gobar. It's called The Barbarian Nurseries. I don't know if it's about LA. But one of the things that he writes a lot about is the fact that you have this sort of culture of servitude even here, and the sort of dynamic of that, and then the children observing this new dynamic of intimate labor and sort of the care deficits and the global love deficits, and then the children kind of growing up with that notion of with the notions of cultures of servitude, that some people from some backgrounds should be put in certain categories while others shouldn't.
Great, okay. Let's go in the back.
I've been able to follow this for a long time because of being involved at Chancee, and it seems to me like after understanding a little bit of the history of this, that the most effective tool that's actually we've been able to utilize towards human trafficking is tenacity. And that's just because of, since '95, Chancee's been fighting for this thing. But, I mean, she's come up against a lot of battles. I mean, in '95, when she was doing the El Monte garment workers case, they ended up shipping off all of the victims as as illegal aliens. And she was one of the first people that was actually the visionaries towards fighting for the rights of these people. The same thing is with the Trans-Bay Steel case with the EEOC. The case almost didn't even go to trial. So just because of the intimate knowledge here, and just from a sociological point of view of being told that no, that's not right, or no, we shouldn't do that, can you guys give a little bit of insight for everybody else who's doing the fight? Because here's some very great successes that people can borrow from, but also it's the trenches, it's the day in, the day out. It's when when the Department of Justice dropped the case against the farm workers case. What is it that picks you up? What is it that keeps you going? And what is it that keeps people going in the room for later on to make this fight the long-term fight as opposed to a short-term goal?
Boy, that's a good question. Well, persistence, tenacity, passion for justice, really wanting to see change happen in your lifetime, that fire in the belly, gotta keep it going. But by far, compared to anything else and everything else that ICC is engaged in, whether it's building affordable housing, creating a public market, or providing, healthcare access and all that, it is really the work on behalf of trafficked victims and exploited migrants that's really most inspiring and remarkable, because we are able to witness this incredible transformation that takes place where, as I mentioned earlier, the victims are truly empowered and then But, you know, we also need to ensure that the survivors of slavery trafficking will not endure a second captivity of poverty and dependence upon their liberation. So we're fortunate that as a community economic development agency, where we are really invested in helping people become economically more mobile and self-sufficient, that these workers can access capital to start their own micro-enterprises and businesses and become truly independent beyond liberation. And I think because we've seen the success of that, that keeps us going. But I really need to also give a shout out to our caseworkers and staff attorney who are in the audience that work in the trenches day in and day out. I like to stand. We have Wanda and Tanya and Hanida. So, you know, these are the people who are in the trenches day in, day out, and taking the workers to enroll their public benefits once they become certified traffic victims, and reuniting them with families, working with International Office of Migration, bringing the families here, going to the airport to reunite those families, and then enrolling the kids into schools and getting them into new housing that's adequate for a large family, and you know, just hooking up utilities. I mean, the day in and day out. And I think if anyone could really speak to that, would be our staff here today.
Mark Twain once said that the only fate worse than being involved in a lawsuit is death itself. So when you're talking about litigation, you're dealing with something that for most people is an acculturation experience. But that becomes compounded when you're dealing with linguistic barriers, when you're dealing with individuals from different countries who have a different perception about what the government can do, and it's never positive. When you're dealing with different issues of gender identity. The challenge for us as lawyers often becomes one of an act of faith, that by having somebody come forward to say, in the words of the farm worker movement, ya basta, enough, and speak up, that is going to have an empowering effect, and that's going to be transformative for that individual and potentially other individuals. When you're dealing with individuals on a day in, day out basis, you know, sometimes that act of faith, frankly, you know, will be shaken, because you're always concerned about the problem of re-victimization in terms of having people talk about this. And that becomes a real challenge, I think, for a lot of us in all disciplines, and I think lawyers as well. But I think at the end of the day, I think there's an act of faith, and which I think is confirmed when you see success, when you see the empowerment of a number of individuals, a number of immigrant workers who've been discriminated against, women who have been sexually harassed, who are able to coalesce in numbers. Now, one of the challenges that we're facing, I'll just call this the, these 2.0 issues, is that we're pretty fortunate at the ESC that we have a pretty well-established Spanish-speaking infrastructure. And I think throughout the United States, not in Alabama, but I think throughout the United States, there are NGOs that have provided services to Spanish-speaking communities. But the immigrant stream is incredibly diverse. And now we're facing challenges to make sure that individuals who are Somali in Greeley, Colorado, are able to come out. Haitian workers in Central Florida are able to speak up. The Thai workers, and frankly, we have to approach this with a certain amount of humility, because we don't have the inherent cultural competence within the agency, unfortunately, to deal with the issues at the scale that we're dealing with. And one way that we deal with that is I think that we work very effectively with the non-governmental organizations serving particular communities. It's been absolutely essential to use the old-fashioned vouching system and work with these organizations to sort of help create the safe space that we probably could not do alone. So we worked with the Amok, we worked with Coalition, we worked with Southern Poverty Law Center, and that's really helped us. But again, this is something where we have some seeds of capacity, but as an agency and certainly as a government, I think there's much, much more work to do.
One more response, and then we'll give a couple of more questions.
Oh, I just wanted to follow to that and just, I mean, my background, in workers' rights started with just representing immigrant workers, documented workers who were fired for trying to join a union or not given the minimum wages they were entitled to. So I think my approach, a lot of this is really, as a starting point, we have to value all workers more than we do in this country. And I think again, I mean, once we do that, and a lot of it, of course, the problem being that when you don't have, and again, all the important enforcement work, when you don't have the on-the-ground sort of organizations, when you don't have a union, 6.6% of the private sector workforce is represented by a union. And so the lower that goes, the more likely you're going to have the abuses that we talked about and we've seen today. So I think that's really where we need to start sort of looking holistically at workers' rights for all.
Okay. Come over here.
I was, from what Marianne was talking about, she was talking about harsher immigration laws in Europe that were responding to some trafficking policies. I hadn't heard much here about that. I wondered about, I was just wondering, we had these great successes with some of these cases, but is this a double-edged sword? I mean, what happens to the immigrants who are undocumented, who aren't in these cases? Is there more pressure? As we know with the whole trafficking framework, that sex workers are the victims of the anti-trafficking policy. And I just feel that while we're looking at our great success, I feel like, as workers in the field, we need to work all the time to also, when there's problematic immigration laws, when sex workers and people of color are discriminated against because of the trafficking laws. And I feel like that's something that's not happening, and that I'd like to see more of, to be able to say, sex work, sex work and other labor.
Okay. Let's get another question. Back to this question. There, right there. Yeah, you, right? You. Yes, you, yes.
I had a question regarding the period when the survivors come to the organizations and they file for their visa, and then there's a period where they're waiting forever to get their employment authorization card. That can go from 1 month to a year or 2 years. Now, the point is that when they are, it's the economy and their situation that brought them there. And they want to pay back, and they're waiting 2 years or 1 year for their employment authorization card. I remember working with them and how difficult it was to get with the immigration officers to even respond to a phone call. In the meanwhile, what are they expecting those survivors to do? I just want to know what's going on that end. How is that gap being shortened?
Okay. Either responses to either one of those questions. Pardis or Aquilina, you haven't responded very much.
Well, I agree with you in terms of, it needs to be addressed on a wider issue of workers' rights. And for us, that is how we deal with it, trafficking and undocumented workers, and kind of goes along with the other question too, in terms of most of ours are all undocumented workers, and we are finding different ways to address very specific immediate needs that they have, while also engaging them in larger fights, building up grassroots legislation and campaigns that can, help them transform themselves in terms of coming to collective action, but then also helping to transform in society how we're viewing the workers themselves, and seeing then the whole spectrum, how also to the extremes of trafficking that all of these abuses happen. And so when we have members who are not able to get working authorization for a long time, they operate as the rest of our members do, as undocumented workers. And we are trying to create, different models. We're actually working on a worker-owned cooperative that you can be any kind of immigration status and be a part of, and then it's a worker-owned cooperative agency, caregiving agency that takes the place of traditional agencies that, take an enormous amount of the fees that the families are paying on a daily basis, and instead, giving it back to, well, one, helping families to better afford, but then helping to raise the conditions and wages of workers in an empowering model where they're also owners, and where it's actually a space where we are able to bring both consumers, the families who are hiring the workers, together with the workers in a different way, so that we can change the relationships that they have, we can transform the type of communication that they have, so that we can bring up the issues, because most employees of domestic workers, a lot of them don't consider themselves employers, and so there's a lot that, not out of any bad intention, never consider different issues, and it's just take different assumptions that the worker always wants to work, that them being late or isn't going to affect the domestic worker, or it doesn't matter so much, or just different things that they don't necessarily even consider. We can bring up in that space and help to transform it, while at the same time we are trying to transform immigration laws, transform the labor laws, and do it by the workers themselves speaking out, defining what are their needs, and defining what legislation is going to actually improve things, and with a larger strategy of how do we create power as workers, so as part of the working class.
And I think one of the things that this panel has, spoken to really well is just how much domestic workers in particular are rendered invisible because they operate in the privacy of homes. And one of the really troubling frameworks that I heard a lot in the Gulf, and I hear here, is sort of framing of caregivers or domestic workers as one of the family, but not, right? And so it's this idea that, well, she probably, she probably enjoys this, working 18 hours a day. Well, we treat her, we're giving her a roof over her head, and we're making things better for her. When you talk to the employers, I would hear that a lot. Well, we're making things better for her, without understanding that you kind of think they're one of us, but that's not how you treat them. And so the very murky space in particular that intimate labor occupies, that as it's very gendered and rendered more and more visible with sort of our understandings of capital and intimacy and workplace.
Yeah, and I think it's that very nature. I mean, if you think about, you mentioned earlier the fact that so little of the private sector is organized in communities. The kind of fragmented domestic space really creates a big problem for organizing these workers, right? And so maybe one of the things as we start to wind down here is to, final comments about what will it take to scale up this organization and to build the kind of, if we're talking about vulnerable worker, a kind of empowered workforce, right, that deals with all of these questions, beyond individual, small spaces that are intimate at the home. So what do you all think is sort of something that we need to work towards collectively in order to build those kinds of relationships to organize to scale? Then we can start with down here, go this way maybe, since we started.
Oh, yeah, just quickly.
Or any final comments, you can ignore my question.
No, actually I wanted to respond to that because again, I think we talk about empowerment, right? And I think this panel has shown that there is a couple of times when empowerment is needed, right? At some point, either the workers have to be empowered to deal with their trafficking situation, deal with their employer. How does that empowerment happen? What is the trigger for that? Is it contact with a union or an NGO or a worker rights presentation perhaps given at a local community center? Is it again, and then when you talk about the point in which they're actually liberated, as was mentioned, there's a lot of empowerment that has to go on there. So a lot of citizenship, education, and again, I think the worker centers and the community groups and the unions play a pivotal role in terms of like making sure this doesn't happen again, and once they're quote liberated, that they don't go back into a situation where they're not empowered at the workplace, whatever workplace it is. And so again, I think it's a constant kind of level of education or level of of information and outreach that has to happen. And again, I know that resources are strained, but that's really, I think, the important part of what's going on here in terms of these workers and these groups.
We have 3 minutes. Any final questions?
Having played the policy game in Washington and been a field lawyer in Phoenix, Arizona, I am very confirmed in my views that what really matters usually emerges from the grassroots level. What really matters in terms of the work that we do when we've been able to be transformative structurally at the agency or externally in terms of the litigation will emerge often from personal relationships. And I mentioned Barbara Canino finding out about this case in the church. There's stories behind the Trans Bay case also in terms of how that emerges from personal relationships. The way that we look at issues, you know, a good idea will go very, very far. And the good ideas tend to emerge when you give people the organizational space to be creative, to be imaginative. So, you know, having gone from Washington to Phoenix, back to Washington, I have, you know, grown increasingly skeptical about the ability to do anything top down. It all has to come from the most micro relationships, and that's what will spread. And our work in this area, you know, in many ways, the seed was planted by a church relationship or by a personal relationship in Los Angeles, and you know, just the knowledge on the part of our attorneys that they had enormous latitude structurally to go get the bad guys, and they did.
Okay. Any final comments? 1 minute.
Okay, I just want to respond to Carol's point that it is true, not every trafficking case or labor exploitation case has victims who feel empowered or witnesses willing to testify or serve as material witnesses. Not every trafficking case is met by a legal team willing and able to champion their cause in court. And not every trafficking case really captures the attention of the media. So our work, you know, is not done. It only just begun, really. So that's why I really believe all the social justice organizations here around this room, around the country, should really forge a stronger and more powerful union that will broadcast throughout the world their determination to put an end to these kinds of social injustices and devastation caused by trafficking. Because it's really the work that we do on behalf of these victims that constitutes the real social change. You know, like what I was saying early, it's by fighting trafficking and slavery that we really challenge those underlying cultural values which govern the relations between genders and social classes. And it's ultimately this work that will challenge also the existing power structures and the caste system that can make trafficking possible. And so really we need to be united and not competing and working together in a, yeah, it's kind of stronger.
And just really briefly too, we have to realize the importance of organizing in these vulnerable sectors and the support for organizing for domestic workers. Where is the power? How can we, and we've struggled, we're part of National Domestic Workers Alliance, and so how do we build the power, how do you unionize domestic workers, right? Who will have all individual employers, you know? How do you build a power for the domestic workers to be able to establish their labor rights? And so there's got to be a support for the organization of these sectors and taking off all of the barriers, the anti-union barriers that are being put up, and although recognizing that not all traditional unions right now, our workers are not attractive members for them because they have an individual employer or very small agencies, you know, so and so supporting the worker centers as well. We have an MOU with the AFL-CIO on a national level and exploring different talks, but that's a whole other complicated issue of how we actually build a real power, not tokenism for these workers.
And finally, I think this building also transnational.
And transnational, absolutely.
Right? And one of the silos we have is sort of
Okay, thank you for coming. Thank you for the panel.